Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here at this very important conference. And so my intellectual journey in about 8.5 minutes. Here we go. My interest in forming a Christian mind was first aroused during my first degree, which concentrated on politics and philosophy. That's more years ago than I wish to admit, but it's at least 3 decades, let me just say that. I brought to university some pressing questions already, which seemed to me to arise directly out of my reading of Scripture itself. Because Scripture seemed to talk frequently and powerfully about the injunction on all believers to seek justice in society. It's a good time to switch off your phones. And so I brought those questions with me simply from my reading of Scripture, but I'd heard remarkably little about those sorts of questions in the Christian circles that I'd moved in until that point. And I very quickly at university became aware of a serious lack of credible resources to help me relate my faith both to practical politics as a campaign for justice, so to speak, and to political science and political theory as an academic discipline. Very little in my many years of exposure to evangelical churches, conferences, student groups, etc., until then had prepared me for that challenge, or even indicated that these were important and worthy callings for Christians. That was then. Anyway, over time, I was blessed by being able to identify a series of resources of people, literature, organizations working in this area. And that led, cutting a long story short, led me eventually to spend 3 years doing an MPhil at a Christian graduate school in Canada, back in the 1980s, where I was able to specialize in Christian political theory in what was effectively a department of philosophy and theology. And I just want to add here, as a footnote to our earlier discussion, you would still have to go abroad today to pursue that particular kind of field in a department of philosophy or politics. There's nowhere in the UK that you can do that. Well, over time I became increasingly aware of the scope and depth of the challenge that Christians face in bringing their faith to bear on an academy that had been so pervasively secularized over the last 2 centuries. And I'm thinking of the term secularization there in terms of the content of the disciplines themselves, the subject matter, the leading paradigms, the intellectual philosophical frameworks, the research agendas. Leaving Christians, at least those outside theology departments, which of course is most people, facing a crisis of what Alistair McIntyre, one of the 20th century's leading Christian philosophers, has termed resourcelessness. That is a situation when a tradition of thought becomes intellectually exhausted and disempowered, and therefore cannot confront the challenges it faces from outside itself. That's what I was experiencing then, as somebody beginning to think about a lifetime of Christian scholarship. And so the result of that was, and I think still to a considerable extent is, that most Christian scholars and most ordinary Christians think politically in ways largely indistinguishable from the wider secular academy and society, and so therefore incapable of offering an authentically Christian interpretation or response to that state of affairs. Well, I realized that if this situation were to be addressed, it would take not just a few ad hoc conferences or study days like this one, or the odd journal article, or even the odd book, but generations of sustained work by successive cohorts of Christian scholars, not something that could be fixed in a day. And that this was a major challenge for the church, which at that time it was hardly aware of. Well, while I was at graduate school in Canada, I did feel a clear calling, a Christian calling, to take up the challenge of exploring the Christian perspective in my chosen field, which is political theory. So I then went to do a PhD at London School of Economics in Christian political theory, and then held various teaching positions in the UK and elsewhere, also back in Canada. Returning to the UK in 2006 to head up the Kirby Laing Institute for Christian Ethics. And as I wrote to Julian Rivers, who was then the chair of the Advisory Council. I'm not really an ethicist, but would you be interested? And I managed to fool him into appointing me to a position for which I was completely unqualified. So thank you for that moment of forgetfulness, Julie. So my own work, just very briefly, has focused on a cluster of themes surrounding the notion of the state, which is, in my view, the central concept in politics and political theory. And I was particularly interested in developing, exploring a Christian conception, or exploring multiple Christian conceptions of the state, especially as it relates to religious, cultural, and institutional diversity and plurality. That's the sort of focus of my own work. So I've done work on how liberal political thought and liberal polities responds to religion and culture, the relationship between state and civil society, multiculturalism, and latterly some new work on the role of the state in the ecological crises that we face today. So, how many minutes have we got left? 1 minute left. Okay, you were supposed to tell me. Two. Okay. Just let me conclude with a remark in general about where we are today, it seems to me. So, my story started 35 years ago. That was then. Things have changed a great deal now, which is why we have days like this and many other initiatives and opportunities for young Christian scholars to find resources, find networks, find support in many different contexts, in the secular university and in other settings as well. A vastly changed landscape from 30, 40 years ago, it seems to me. There's obviously still a huge amount of skepticism and a lot of bafflement and some pockets of hostility to anything like the idea of faith-based scholarship, but there are new openings appearing all the time. So this is a very exciting time, a time of great opportunity to consider your calling as young Christian scholars, or if you're not in that position yourself, to look out for others whom you might encourage to take up the vocation of a Christian scholar as a worthy, a noble, necessary Christian calling of equal value to church ministry, missionary work, evangelism, and all those other very important things that the church must do. It seems to me that, June has already mentioned this, in a climate which at least is partly expressed by the term post-modernity, the door of what I would call the modernist university is beginning to crack open slightly to be receptive to the open articulation of faith-based scholarship, or faith-inspired scholarship, put it that way, and that these opportunities are ones that we should seize and walk through those doors and be creative, faithful Christian presences within the university in many different settings, with a larger view in mind to gradually turning around that 200-year period of deep secularization of the university, for the purpose of what? Not to be evangelists. The role of this Christian scholar is not to be an evangelist. It's rather to be a contributor to the intellectual common good of the academy and society as a whole, to seek the welfare of the city, so to speak, in the academy. And I'd encourage many of you to think about that for yourselves, or to inspire others to take up that challenge.